Cabin 6, Camp Meridian. Every summer camp has a cabin nobody wants to sleep in, and every camp counselor learns within their first season exactly which one it is before anybody officially tells them. At Camp Meridian, it was Cabin 6, tucked at the far edge of the property, where the mowed grass gave way to actual forest, separated from the other cabins by just enough distance that a scream from inside it. Campers used to joke, probably wouldn't carry far enough for anyone to hear. I spent 4 summers working at that camp before I finally understood that the joke wasn't really a joke, and that the distance between Cabin 6 and everything else wasn't an accident of the original camp layout at all. It was a decision made deliberately by whoever built that camp to put as much space as possible between that particular cabin and every other building on the property. And I have spent the 2 years since my last summer there trying to understand exactly what they knew that made them build it that way. My name is Jordan Ashby. I worked as a camp counselor at Camp Meridian, a private summer camp on the shore of a mid-sized lake in the Northeast. From the time I was 19 until I was 22, 4 consecutive summers that I'd remember, if none of this had ever happened, as some of the best of my life. Good friends, meaningful work with kids, long, easy evenings by the water that felt at the time like they'd go on forever. I want you to understand the context before I tell you about my 4th and final summer there, because I think it matters that I loved that place, genuinely and completely, before I ever had reason to fear it. Cabin 6 sat empty every summer I worked there, officially designated as storage space for extra bunks and off-season equipment, rather than housing for campers, a fact that new counselors were told when they asked had something to do with an old structural issue, a foundation problem, water damage, something vaguely mechanical that made the building unsuitable for overnight use, without ever quite specifying what the actual problem was or why. Given 4 full summers of camp operation, nobody had ever gotten around to fixing it. The older counselors, the ones who'd been coming back for 5 or 6 seasons by the time I started, had a different explanation, delivered in the careful, half-joking tone people use for stories they don't quite want to admit they believe. Cabin 6, they said, had been the site of a drowning in the 1970s. A camper, named Tommy Reyes, who'd slipped out after lights out one August night to swim alone in the lake and never made it back, found the next morning by a search party organized before dawn, floating near the dock closest to that cabin's stretch of shoreline. The camp had closed Cabin 6 that same summer and never reopened it for overnight use again, and the story, as it had been passed down through nearly 5 decades of counselors, held that something about Tommy Reyes had never actually left, that campers who'd stayed too close to that cabin at night, working late summer maintenance shifts or sneaking off from a bonfire, had reported hearing a boy's voice calling from the direction of the lake, asking in a small, plaintive tone whether anyone wanted to go swimming. I heard this story my first summer and treated it, the way I suspect every counselor before me had treated it, as exactly the kind of local legend that gives a camp a little extra flavor. Spooky enough to be fun, telling around a fire, distant enough in both time and plausibility that nobody actually organized their behavior around it. I spent 3 full summers walking past Cabin 6 on a near-daily basis, cutting through that stretch of the property on my way to the boathouse or the maintenance shed, without a single strange thing happening to me. And by my 4th summer, I'd have told you, with total confidence, that the whole story was nothing more than camp folklore, harmless and a little bit fun. The same category as every other slightly too elaborate ghost story passed down at every camp in the country. My 4th summer changed that, and it changed it on a night in late July that started, like most nights at Camp Meridian, with nothing more dramatic than a group of counselors sitting up past curfew after the campers had gone to bed, sharing a case of beer we weren't technically supposed to have on camp property, talking about nothing important under a clear, star-heavy sky. I want to give you a fuller sense of Camp Meridian itself before I go further into that 4th summer, because the place mattered to me in ways that make everything that follows harder rather than easier to tell. It was a modest operation, maybe 120 campers across 6 two-week sessions each summer. A mix of day camp activities and overnight stays for the older age groups, staffed mostly by college students who came back year after year the way I did, drawn by the same combination of decent pay, genuine affection for the kids, and the particular easy camaraderie that develops among a small staff living together on a remote property for an entire summer. The camp's own official history, printed in a small brochure handed out during staff orientation each year, dated the property back to 1962, when a local family donated the land specifically for youth recreation, and made no mention at all of Tommy Reyes or any drowning, an omission that, once I started paying closer attention in my later summers, felt considerably more deliberate than simple oversight. I asked the camp's longtime maintenance supervisor, a quiet, weathered man named Hollis, who'd worked the grounds for over 20 years, whether he knew anything more about Cabin 6's actual history, and he told me, with the specific reluctance of someone who'd clearly been asked this question before and had learned to answer it as briefly as possible, that he'd heard the same story I had, that he avoided that stretch of shoreline himself after dark out of what he called plain common sense, and that he'd prefer not to discuss it further, a request I respected at the time and have regretted respecting ever since, wishing now that I'd pushed him harder for whatever additional detail he was clearly holding back. I found one other counselor in my third summer, a young man named Desmond, who'd worked at the camp for 2 seasons before mine and had left partway through his second summer, under circumstances the other staff described only vaguely as personal reasons. I ran into him by chance the following year at a mutual friends gathering, and when Camp Meridian came up in conversation, his entire demeanor changed. The easy, social version of him replaced almost instantly by something more guarded. I left because of Cabin 6, he told me, once we'd stepped outside, away from the rest of the party, his voice low even though there was no one else around to overhear. I did the same walkthrough everyone does, and I heard the same thing you're describing. The voice, asking about swimming, except I didn't stop at just hearing it. I got close enough to the shoreline, one night stupid and a little drunk, to actually answer it. I said yes, I said sure, I'll go swimming with you. And, for about 10 seconds afterward, nothing happened, and I remember feeling almost let down, like I'd built up something in my head that turned out to be nothing. And then, the water in front of me, maybe 15 feet out, just dropped, like something enormous had displaced it from below. This huge, silent depression forming in the surface, gone as fast as it appeared. And I ran back to the counselor cabin so fast I don't actually remember most of the run, and I quit 2 days later. And I have never been near a lake after dark again in my entire life since. It was maybe 11:30 when one of the newer counselors, a college freshman named Beth who'd only worked at the camp for a few weeks, mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd heard something strange near Cabin 6 2 nights earlier while doing her assigned evening walkthrough of the property. It sounded like a kid, she said, calling out from somewhere near the water, right around that cabin. Asked if I wanted to come swimming. I figured it was one of the boys' cabins messing around, sneaking out. But when I checked, everyone was accounted for. All the cabins, all the kids, nobody missing, nobody out of bed. The other counselors, the ones who'd been there longer, went quiet in a way I recognized. The specific quiet of people who've heard a story enough times that, hearing it repeated by someone new, makes it uncomfortably real again. And I remember laughing, at the time, a little too loudly, and saying something dismissive about camp legends taking on a life of their own, mostly because some part of me wanted very badly for that to be the actual explanation. I want to tell you about what happened 2 nights later, because it's the reason I no longer laugh at that story, and the reason I have not been back to Camp Meridian, or any body of water after dark, in the 2 years since. I'd drawn the late-night property walk-through that Thursday, a standard rotating duty among the senior counselors, checking that all the cabins were secure, all the campers accounted for, nothing left unattended around the waterfront or the fire pit before the whole camp settled in for the night. It was a walk I'd done dozens of times over 4 summers, familiar enough that I usually did it half on autopilot, thinking about anything except the actual task in front of me. I was maybe 2/3 through the route, approaching the stretch of shoreline nearest cabin 6, when I heard it. A boy's voice, young, maybe 8 or 9 years old by the pitch of it, calling out from the direction of the water, close enough that it should have been easy to spot whoever was speaking, especially with the near full moon giving decent visibility across that whole stretch of shore. "Hey, do you want to go swimming?" I want to describe exactly what I felt in that moment, because I think the specific, layered quality of it matters. My first reaction was ordinary practical alarm, a kid out of bed, alone, near open water. Exactly the kind of situation camp counselors are trained to respond to immediately and seriously. I called out, asking who was there, moving toward the sound with my flashlight raised, fully expecting to find some camper who'd snuck out on a dare, ready to deliver the kind of stern, relieved lecture you give a kid who's scared you badly enough that your fear needs somewhere to go. There was no one there. The shoreline near cabin 6 was completely empty, moonlit and still, the lake's surface flat and undisturbed in every direction my flashlight could reach. And the voice, when it came again, seemed to originate from a spot several feet out into the water itself, from a patch of surface that showed no ripple, no disturbance. Nothing to indicate anything was actually present there, generating a sound. "Please, I don't want to swim alone." I did the head count immediately, the way training demanded, moving cabin to cabin with a speed that must have looked, to anyone watching, like genuine panic rather than routine procedure. Every camper was accounted for, every bed occupied, no windows open, no screens cut, nothing to suggest any child had actually left their cabin that night. And I stood there afterward, back at the edge of that same stretch of shoreline, staring out at flat, empty water, trying to reconcile what I'd just confirmed with what I'd just heard, and finding no way to make the two things fit together at all. I told myself, standing there, that I'd misheard something ordinary, a bird, an animal, sound carrying strangely across water, the way it sometimes does, distorted just enough by distance and darkness to sound briefly like a child's voice. I want to tell you that I mostly believed that explanation, walking back to the counselor cabins that night right up until the following week when it happened to me again, and this time I wasn't alone to second-guess what I'd heard. Beth and I were both assigned to the late walkthrough that Wednesday, a rare doubled-up rotation, because one of the other senior counselors had gone home sick, and we were maybe halfway through the route, approaching that same stretch of shoreline, when we both stopped at the exact same moment, both having heard, with no possibility of one of us simply mishearing an animal or a distant sound the other hadn't caught. The same small, plaintive voice, calling from the same patch of undisturbed water. "Do you want to go swimming? I'm still waiting." I still waiting. That phrase, added this time, that hadn't been, part of what I'd heard alone the week before, settled into my chest with a specific, cold weight, because it suggested something my mind had been actively avoiding since the first incident. Not a random, repeating phenomenon, but something aware enough of the passage of time to comment on it. Something that understood, in whatever limited way a 50-year-old drowning might understand anything, that it had been waiting considerably longer than any reasonable child should have to wait for a friend to come swimming. Beth grabbed my arm, hard, and we did the head count together. Both of us, cabin by cabin, and again, every camper was accounted for. Every bed occupied. Nothing to explain the voice we'd both just heard clearly enough that neither of us could talk the other one into believing we'd imagined it. "That's the story," Beth said, once we were both back at the counselor cabins, sitting on the steps in the dark, neither of us quite ready to go inside and be alone with what we'd just experienced. "The Tommy Reyes thing. That's actually real, isn't it?" I didn't have an answer for her that felt honest and also felt safe to say out loud. I told the camp director about it the next morning, carefully, expecting to be told, kindly but firmly, that I was overtired and needed a few days off, and instead, I watched something shift in her expression that told me, immediately, that this was not the first time she'd had this exact conversation with a counselor. I need you to be very clear with every new counselor about the evening walk-through route near Cabin 6, she said, without addressing my report directly at all, in a way that felt, in hindsight, like a confirmation more damning than if she'd simply told me she believed me outright. Nobody does that leg of the route alone after 10 p.m., starting this week. Pair everyone up, and if anyone reports hearing anything unusual near that shoreline, you bring them straight to me, and you do not discuss it with the campers, under any circumstances. I asked her directly whether she believed the Tommy Reyes story was real. She was quiet for a long moment, looking out toward the lake through her office window, and then she told me something that I have thought about more than almost anything else from that entire summer. More than the voice itself, more than the cold, unnatural weight of that patch of undisturbed water. I don't know what's out there, she said. I've worked at this camp for 11 years, and I've heard some version of this story from at least 6 different counselors over that time. Always the same basic shape. Always near that same stretch of shore. What I do know is that we've never had an actual incident. No camper's ever gone missing. No one's ever been hurt. Not once in the 11 years I've run this place. I've made my peace with treating it as something we manage rather than something we solve, because I don't know how you'd even begin to solve something like this, and because so far, whatever's out there seems content just to ask. I'm more worried about what happens the day someone finally answers. I finished that summer, my 4th and last, without any further incidents beyond that one shared experience with Beth. Though I noticed over the following weeks that I'd developed a habit of avoiding that stretch of shoreline entirely whenever I could root around it, a habit several of the other longtime counselors, I realized once I started paying attention, already shared, without ever having discussed it openly. I finished that summer, my 4th and last, without any further incidents beyond that one shared experience with Beth. Though I noticed over the following weeks that I'd developed a habit of avoiding that stretch of shoreline entirely whenever I could root around it, a habit several of the other longtime counselors, I realized, once I started paying attention, already shared without ever having discussed it openly. I want to describe one final incident before I close this account, something that happened in the last week of that final summer, because it's the detail that has stayed with me most persistently in the years since, more than the voice itself, more than Desmond's account of the water dropping away in front of him. A group of us were closing down the waterfront for the season, packing away canoes and life jackets on a gray, overcast afternoon, well before dark. Nothing about the hour or the light suggesting any reason for caution. One of the youngest counselors on staff, a 19-year-old named Priya, who'd never heard the Cabin 6 story in any detail, having joined only that final session, wandered down near that same stretch of shoreline to retrieve a stray paddle, and called out to the rest of us, in a bright, unconcerned voice, asking if any of us recognized a boy standing near the tree line by Cabin 6, said he looked lost, said maybe he'd wandered over from one of the other camps up the lake. Every one of us, who'd been there longer, went completely still. I looked toward the tree line myself, in broad gray daylight, and saw nothing at all. No boy, no movement, nothing but the ordinary empty stretch of grass and trees that had always surrounded that cabin. But 3 of us, independently, when we compared notes afterward, had all felt the exact same thing in that instant. A sudden, sharp drop in temperature that had no business occurring on an overcast but otherwise mild afternoon, gone as quickly as it had come, the moment Priya's attention moved on to something else, and she forgot, within a few seconds, that she'd ever mentioned seeing anyone there at all. I didn't go back. The following summer, I told myself and everyone who asked that I'd simply aged out of camp work, that it was time to move on to something more suited to where I was in my life, And all of that was true in its own way, but it wasn't the whole truth, and I think writing this now I owe it to whoever might end up working at a place like Camp Meridian someday to say the rest of it plainly. I don't know who or what Tommy Reyes actually was, or whether the name attached to that story even belongs to a real person who really drowned in that lake in the 1970s. I never found any documentation, camp records from that era having apparently been lost or discarded long before I ever worked there, and no local newspaper archive I could find covering a drowning at that specific camp in any specific year. I know only what I heard. Twice, with a witness the second time who heard exactly the same thing I did, and I know that whatever's waiting in that undisturbed patch of water near Cabin 6 has been asking the same question, patiently, for at least as long as the oldest counselor's story about it stretches back, and that the camp director, after 11 years of managing rather than solving whatever it actually is, seemed more afraid of someone finally saying yes than of anything the voice itself had ever directly done. I think about that phrase sometimes, late at night, the same way I think about most of what happened that summer. I'm still waiting. I hope whoever's working the late walkthrough at Camp Meridian this summer, that they keep it that way. Waiting, patient, unanswered, forever if it has to be. Because I don't think any of us actually want to find out what happens the day somebody, finally, tired or lonely or simply careless enough, decides to say yes.